I didn't make any grand announcements when I walked into that emergency HOA meeting on Tuesday night. I just set my worn leather folder on the conference table, opened it to the first page, slid the water rights deed across to their president, Margaret Thornfield. The color drained from her face so fast I thought she might faint. Behind her is her lawyer, some hotshot from downtown, who'd been throwing around cease and desist letters like confetti, picked up the document with shaking hands. When he saw the county clerk's seal and the date stamp from 1943, he actually whispered, "Oh my God," under his breath. That's when I knew they finally understood what they'd built their precious Willowbrook estates on top of. My great-grandfather's water retention system, my land, my dam. But let me back up, because this whole mess started 3 years ago when I inherited my great-grandfather's property up in the hill country outside Austin. Pop-Pop had been a civil engineer back in the day, one of those Depression-era men who could build anything with his bare hands and a slide rule. He'd bought 847 acres of rocky, worthless land back in 1941 for practically nothing, land that everyone said was too steep, too dry, too remote to ever amount to anything. What they didn't know was that Pop-Pop had spent 2 years studying the watershed patterns and underground springs in that area. He built himself a modest stone house on the high ground, and then he did something brilliant. He engineered and constructed a water retention dam system that could capture and hold the spring runoff from about 15 square miles of hill country. The property had been in my family ever since, mostly sitting empty except for hunting season, and the occasional weekend when Pop-Pop would drive up to check on things. After he passed, my dad inherited it, but never did much with the place. He had his own life, his own career in San Antonio. When Dad died 5 years ago, the land came to me. I was going through a pretty rough divorce at the time, dealing with some health issues that had forced me into early retirement from my job as a county surveyor, and I needed somewhere quiet to figure out my next chapter. The old stone house needed work, but it had good bones. More importantly, it had something I desperately needed: silence. I spent the better part of a year fixing the place up, learning the land the way Pop-Pop had taught me to do when I was a kid. I replaced the roof, updated the plumbing, and slowly brought the house back to life. Every morning I'd walk the property lines with my coffee, checking fence posts and gates, clearing brush, just getting to know every creek bed and limestone outcrop. The dam system was still functional after all these years, though it needed some maintenance. Pop-Pop had built it to last. Stone and concrete and steel rebar that could survive anything Texas weather could throw at it. The main reservoir held about 40 million gallons when it was full, and it fed a series of smaller ponds and irrigation channels that had kept the lower valley green, even during drought years. I wasn't bothering anybody. I kept to myself, minded my own business, and slowly started to heal from everything I'd been through. Some mornings I'd sit on the dam wall with my fishing rod, watching the sun come up over the water. Other days I'd work on projects around the house, or take long walks through the oak groves. It was the first peace I'd had in years. I should have known it wouldn't last. The trouble started in late spring of my second year on the property. Been noticing survey stakes showing up on the lower end of my land, down in the valley where Pop-Pop's water system fed into a series of natural meadows. At first I figured it was just a boundary survey, maybe the county updating their records, or a neighbor checking their property lines. But then the stakes multiplied, and I started seeing crews with theodolites and GPS equipment mapping out what looked like building lots. That's when I drove down to the county courthouse to do some research. What I found made my blood run cold. A development company called Pinnacle Properties had somehow obtained permits to build a residential subdivision called Willowbrook Estates right in the middle of my valley. According to their filings, they were planning 35 single-family homes, complete with a community center, playground, and private roads. The paperwork all looked legitimate, with proper zoning approvals and environmental clearances. There was just one problem: they were planning to build it on my land. I drove straight to Pinnacle's offices and asked to speak with someone in charge. The receptionist kept me waiting for an hour before finally admitting me to see their development. Manager, a slick-talking guy in an expensive suit who introduced himself as Brad Hoffman. When I explained the situation and showed him my deed, he barely glanced at it before giving me a condescending smile. "Sir, I understand your concern, But our legal team has done extensive research on this property. The land in question has been declared abandoned under Texas Property Code Section 75.002. When property taxes go unpaid for more than 3 consecutive years, the state can authorize development for the public good. We've followed all proper procedures. I tried to explain that the taxes had never gone unpaid, that I had receipts going back decades, but Brad just kept talking over me. He handed me a business card and suggested I consult with a real estate attorney if I had concerns. Then he had security escort me out of the building. That night, I spent hours going through Pop's old files and my dad's records, making sure I had every piece of documentation in order. The taxes had been paid faithfully every year. The deed was clear and unencumbered. I owned that land free and clear, and I had the paperwork to prove it. The next morning, I drove back to the county courthouse and started making inquiries about how Pinnacle had gotten their permits approved. What I discovered was a masterclass in bureaucratic corruption. Somehow the land records had been updated to show my valley property as abandoned and available for development. The person who'd authorized those changes was Margaret Thornfield, who'd been serving as interim county clerk while the elected clerk was on medical leave, who also happened to be married to one of Pinnacle Properties' major investors. Margaret Thornfield, who was about to become the founding president of the Willowbrook Estates Homeowners Association. I tried going through proper channels first. I filed complaints with the county, sent registered letters to Pinnacle's legal team, and even hired an attorney to draft formal notices about the property dispute. But every letter got lost. Every complaint got shuffled to the bottom of some pile. And my attorney kept telling me that these things take time to work through the system. Meanwhile, Pinnacle's construction crews were clearing trees and grading roads like they owned the place. By fall, they'd started pouring foundations. By winter, they had framing going up on the first dozen houses. I'd drive down there some mornings and just sit in my truck watching strangers build homes on land that had been in my family for 8 decades. The worst part was that they were building right on top of Pop's irrigation channels. It's completely disrupting the water system he'd spent years perfecting. They had no idea what they were destroying. That's when I stopped trying to work within the system and started thinking like the engineer I'd been trained to be. I pulled out every survey map, watershed study, and engineering report that Pop had ever created for that property. I spent weeks in the county archives, photographing every document I could find about water rights, easements, and infrastructure development in that area. What I found was better than I dared to hope. Pop hadn't just built a dam system on his own property. Under Texas water law, he'd filed for and been granted riparian rights to all the water that flowed through that entire watershed, not just the part on his land, but every creek, spring, and seasonal runoff that fed into his reservoirs.
Those
rights had never expired, never been sold, never been transferred. They came with the land, and they gave me legal control over every drop of water that flowed through Willowbrook Estates. More importantly, I found Pop's original engineering specifications for the dam system. He designed it not just as a water retention facility, but as a flood control system that could be operated manually during heavy rains. There was a series of spillways and release valves that could be opened or closed, depending on weather conditions and water levels. For 70 years, that system had been preventing floods in the lower valley by holding back spring runoff and releasing it gradually throughout the dry season. The new subdivision had been built with the assumption that the natural drainage patterns would remain the same forever. Their stormwater management system was designed to handle normal seasonal runoff, not the kind of flash flooding that could occur if 40 million gallons of water were suddenly released from the reservoir above them. Not that I was planning to flood anyone's home, you understand? I'm not that kind of person. I was definitely planning to make some strategic adjustments to my water management schedule. I started by having my own attorney, a different one, who specialized in water rights and environmental law review, all of my documentation. When she confirmed that my position was legally bulletproof, I authorized her to file a series of quiet liens against every property in Willowbrook Estates. Since they were all built on land subject to my water rights easement, I had a legitimate claim against each development next. I contacted the Texas Commission on Environmental Quality and filed a formal complaint about the subdivision's interference with an established watershed management system. I provided them with copies of Pop-Pop's original engineering reports, detailed photographs of the disrupted irrigation channels, and expert testimony about the potential downstream flooding risks. TCEQ takes water rights violations very seriously in Texas, especially when they involve established agricultural or flood control systems. Then I started documenting everything. Every day I'd walk through the subdivision with my camera, photographing where their construction had damaged or blocked Pop-Pop's original infrastructure. I took water level measurements at the dam and recorded how their development was affecting the natural drainage patterns. I kept detailed logs of every phone call, every letter, every interaction with Pinnacle Properties or the HOA. The first residents started moving into Willowbrook Estates in early spring. They seemed like nice enough people, young families mostly, attracted by the promise of living in a luxury hill country community with natural water features. They had no idea they were living on disputed property, and they certainly didn't know that their HOA president had basically stolen the land out from under me. Margaret Thornfield wasted no time establishing her authority as HOA president. She immediately started sending me letters about property maintenance violations and unauthorized structures on HOA common land. According to her, my great-grandfather's dam was an illegal obstruction that needed to be removed for the safety and aesthetics of the community. She demanded that I cease all trespassing on HOA property and remove any personal belongings I'd left on their land. I ignored the first few letters, but Margaret was persistent. She started fining me for violations I'd supposedly committed on my own property. When I didn't pay the fines, she threatened to place liens on my house. When I still didn't respond, she hired a security company to patrol the subdivision and prevent me from trespassing on my own land. That's when things got personal. One morning in June, I drove down to check on the dam after a heavy rain and found a security guard blocking the access road. He informed me that I was trespassing on private HOA property and needed to leave immediately. When I tried to explain that this was my land, he threatened to call the sheriff. So I let him call. Deputy Martinez showed up about 20 minutes later, and I handed him copies of my deed, tax records, and water rights documentation. After reviewing everything, he told the security guard that I had every right to be there and suggested that the HOA might want to consult with their attorney before making any more trespassing accusations. The guard left, but I knew this was far from over. Sure enough, within a week, I received a formal cease and desist letter from the HOA's attorney, demanding that I stop harassing residents and interfering with community activities. They were threatening to seek a restraining order if I continued to trespass on HOA property. The letter was full of legal-sounding language designed to intimidate me, but I'd been dealing with lawyers long enough to recognize a bluff when I saw one. When I decided it was time to stop playing defense and start playing offense, I called my attorney and told her to prepare for war. We started by filing a formal lawsuit against Pinnacle Properties, the HOA, and Margaret Thornfield personally, seeking damages for trespass, conversion, and fraudulent conveyance. We demanded immediate cessation of all construction activities and the removal of all structures built on my property without permission. But I wasn't going to wait for the courts to sort everything out. Texas water law gave me immediate authority to manage my own water rights, and I intended to exercise that authority. I spent a weekend going through Pop-Pop's old maintenance logs, learning exactly how his dam system was supposed to operate. Then, I started making some adjustments. The first thing I did was close off about half of the spillways that normally released water gradually into the lower valley. This caused the reservoir level to start rising, which wasn't dangerous yet, but got everyone's attention real quick. Within days, several residents called the county to complain that their natural water features were starting to dry up. Their decorative ponds and seasonal creeks, which depended on continuous flow from my reservoir, were turning into muddy puddles. Next, I started releasing water on my own schedule, instead of following the steady flow pattern that Pop-Pop had maintained. I'd open the spillways wide for a few hours, sending a rush of water through the valley, then close them completely for a day or two. The effect was dramatic. Their carefully landscaped water features would flood for a few hours, then dry up completely. then flood again, just when they thought they'd figured out the pattern. Margaret. Thornfield was furious. She started showing up at my house at all hours, screaming about property damage and threatening to sue me for everything I owned. She brought the HOA's lawyer with her on the third visit. And that's when I invited them both inside to see my documentation. I spread every deed, survey map, water rights filing, and engineering report across my dining room table. I showed them Pop-Pop's original property boundaries, which clearly included everything they'd built their subdivision on. I showed them the water rights filings from 1943, which gave me legal control over every drop of water in the area. And I showed them the TCEQ complaint I'd filed, which could result in the entire subdivision being declared uninhabitable. If they were found to be interfering with an established flood control system, the lawyer went very quiet as he reviewed the documents. After about an hour, he asked if he could make some copies and suggested that Margaret might want to consider settling this matter out of court. Margaret wasn't ready to give up that easily, though. She started making threats about eminent domain and community safety, claiming that my dam was a public hazard that needed to be removed for the greater good. That's when I decided to give them a real demonstration of what a public hazard actually looked like. The next time we had a heavy rain forecast, I opened every spillway and release valve on the dam system. Not enough to cause actual flooding, you understand, but enough to send about 10 million gallons of water rushing through their subdivision over the course of 6 hours. The effect was spectacular. Their decorative ponds overflowed.
Out there, store.
Drains backed up. Their carefully manicured lawns turned into temporary swamps. Several residents had water in their garages. One family had to evacuate their basement when their sump pump couldn't keep up with the sudden influx. Nobody was hurt, and there was no permanent property damage. But the message was crystal clear. I controlled the water. I could turn it on or off whenever I wanted. Margaret called an emergency HOA meeting for the following Tuesday, and that's where this whole story began. I walked into that conference room knowing exactly what I was going to say and exactly what documents I was going to present. When Margaret started screaming about trespassing and property damage, I just opened my leather folder and let the paperwork do the talking. The water rights deed was just the beginning. I had surveys proving that the entire subdivision was built on my land. I had tax records showing continuous ownership going back 80 years. I had engineering reports demonstrating that their construction had damaged an established flood control system. And I had a letter from TCEQ informing them that they had 30 days to restore the original drainage patterns or face federal fines and potential criminal charges. But the document that really got their attention was the purchase offer. I had my attorney prepare a formal offer to buy back my own land from every homeowner in the subdivision. The offer was generous, 20% above current market value for each house, plus moving expenses and legal fees. All they had to do was acknowledge that they'd purchased property that didn't belong to the seller in the first place. The room went dead silent as the residents realized what their options were. They could fight me in court knowing that I had clear legal title to their land, and they'd probably lose everything. Or they could take my offer and walk away with enough money to buy equivalent homes somewhere else. Several families started whispering among themselves. I could see the calculation happening in real time. Margaret tried to rally support, claiming that this was just intimidation and that the HOA's legal team would find a way to fight back. But her own lawyer was already packing up his briefcase. Before leaving, he quietly informed the board that the HOA's insurance policy specifically excluded coverage for disputes involving fraudulent property transfers. If they continued fighting, they'd be on their own financially. That was 6 months ago. Margaret Thornfield resigned from the HOA board the next week and moved out of state to avoid the pending criminal charges for falsifying public records. Pinnacle Properties declared bankruptcy rather than face the class action lawsuit from their investors. 28 of the 35 families in Willowbrook Estates accepted my buyout offer and relocated. The remaining 7 decided to work out lease agreements that allow them to stay on my land as tenants, paying rent. That covers my property taxes and dam maintenance costs. The subdivision still exists, technically, but it's a much quieter place now. The residents who stayed are good neighbors, who understand that they're living on my family's land with my permission. They help me maintain the water system and respect the fact that this place has been in my family for generations. In return, I make sure their homes stay high and dry during heavy rains. I'm back to my quiet mornings by the reservoir, watching the sunrise and listening to the water flow through pop-pop spillways. The dam is working exactly the way he designed it, capturing spring runoff, preventing floods, and providing steady water flow throughout the dry season. The only difference is that now everyone in the valley understands who's really in charge of turning the tap on and off. Some mornings I'll see one of my new tenants walking their dog along the dam wall, and they'll wave respectfully as they pass. Other mornings I sit alone with my coffee, thinking about Pop and how proud he'd be to know that his water system is still protecting the valley after all these years. Either way, it's quiet again. And that's all I ever really wanted.